Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for accepting this invitation. I am Diana Becerra, Global Business Developer at Foregenix. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. This is the first of a series of webinars that we are hosting this year. Some will be also in other languages such as Spanish and Portuguese. We invite you to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. There, we are announcing webinars, sharing blogs, and resources that are relevant for the security industry, so you are very welcome to join us. Today, I'm happy to introduce Paolo Basilio, our Global Head of Practice for PCI Consultancy and Audit Services. He holds more than 15 years of experience within the financial services and information security, and has in-depth knowledge for card scheme-specific regulatory and security standards, particularly focused on operational, fraud, and risk security. And with Paolo is Andrew McKenna. Andrew has extensive experience in information security as a principal consultant to several enterprise clients and also implemented PCI projects. Andrew specialized in subjects such as P2P, tokenization, cloud security, encryption, and compliance. They will be hosting a conversation about cryptographic architectures in an online world. You can submit your questions at any time during the presentation in the chat box. At the end, in the Q&A section, we will solve them. Please welcome Paola and Andrew, and thank you for the knowledge you are sharing with us today. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Diana. Welcome all to the presentation today. Today's presentation is going to address cryptographic architecture in an online and cloud world. And the type of cryptographic architecture we're going to be discussing today is hardware security modules, or HSMs, that are used to store cryptographic keys that secure your data and, of course, perform cryptographic operations within typically sort of government and financial services industry organizations. We'll be discussing the current state of cryptographic architecture and how this type of architecture is managed in today's world, and how the evolution of the management of this infrastructure might be in the future, and the barriers that are in place that could prevent the modernization and evolution of the management of this infrastructure. So today I'm joined by Andy McKenna, a principal consultant and cryptographic specialist at Foregenix as well. As Diana said, with an extremely large amount of experience around crypto and crypto services and solutions. How are you doing, Andy? Andy, I think we're having some audio difficulty there. Oh dear, I think still struggling with the microphone. Well, I think while Andy sorts out the technical, oh, there he is.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can now.
Great. Okay, well, looking forward to chatting with you about this subject today. Yeah,
absolutely. Good thing you got the mic sorted. I would shudder to have to do this presentation on my own.
The joys of being live.
Absolutely. And of course, you know, the online world that we currently live in today, I think very appropriate for the topics that we're going to be discussing. Yeah. With COVID and all, lockdowns, travel restrictions, I think the management of cryptographic architecture has been more difficult today than ever before.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I suppose if we look at the slide in front of us, we see some of the common bugbears we have with the traditional mechanisms of key management, with particular, you know, where it's required for point-to-point encryption and for PIN. So you have people who have to fly between different data centers to perform key management activities. You have a large amount of paperwork when people are, you know, they've got to sign in to a data center. They've got to sign sheets for access to a HSM. They're signing sheets for key components, transcribing key components. there's a big time penalty in terms of the travel and the requirement for physical presence at the HSMs. There's also interoperability issues between different kinds of keys, different kind of HSMs, between user management for HSMs. There's regulatory and compliance issues, and then you've got the the requirement to have multiple people in small physical spaces. And a lot of what we're looking at here is the legacy of the early data encryption standards, where all keys had to be on a physical device. Everyone had to, the key could never leave the physical device. And those standards are 30 or 40 years old. A lot of that hasn't really been modernized. And I think up to now, there's it's been a case of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And with COVID, we've seen that maybe it's not entirely broken because people have always been able to repeat their compliance exercises. But at the same time, we're not able to do a lot of these things. So we have clients who haven't been able to travel to their data centers. They're not able to perform remote key management activities. You're not allowed to get a quorum of people in the same room together to inject keys. So with COVID has kind of, I suppose, accelerated this move to the cloud to an extent, but it also shows us that some of the processes that we currently have they're kind of akin to a messenger on a horse, traveling along with the Caesar cipher to be able to provide to a general during battle, so they know the codes for the day. And things haven't, at the moment we use snail mail. We write down a key component on paper, we put it into a tamper-evident bag, we put it in the post, and we wait a week till our custodian counterpart receives it on the other end. And it must be possible to do things in a more secure, more modern manner than that.
I think it always surprises me that, with the progress of technology in the last 20 years, I mean, I remember doing my first key ceremony about 15, 16 years ago. And, with the advancements of technology and the introduction of the smartphone, that all of this had happened sort of within that time period. But we still seem to do key management ceremonies and management of, keys and cryptographic architecture in the very same way. I think you could probably, you probably have a few of these stories of your own, but there's so many times that I've been in key ceremonies with 5 or 6 other people crammed in a small room or a data center cage or something along those lines, and sort of turning away to try and not see the key component while someone sort of writes it down on a piece of paper. There's the traveling to this data center and that data center, sometimes in different countries, and all of that equals time, and of course it means money, because people are taken out of their day-to-day jobs. Of course, travel expenses, and not only just with the expenses of actually doing operational procedures, but then guys like us, auditors, show up and you've got to demonstrate the procedure just for us, and potentially not for any operational reason. So it becomes an incredible headache, and it's amazing that it still works like this. I think what we'll do now is launch a little poll to find out what is the #1 issue causing you pain with your current cryptographic architecture management, for those joining this webinar that have their own cryptographic architecture to maintain. And the potential answers are paperwork, wasted time, traveling up and down to data centers in different locations and so on, the cost associated with that, interoperability issues across devices. This can also be an issue, or other issues that we may not have mentioned there. So we'll give individuals some time to complete the poll. But yeah, I think an interesting stat that we've kind of measured in terms of how long a key management ceremony typically takes, where you go and create a key or load a key or do something akin to that at an HSM. And on average, just the process, I mean, besides the traveling and so on, these type of processes take about 2 hours, 2.5 hours to complete. And this is, of course, as we mentioned, due to the fact that there isn't, or there's lots of paperwork to complete. There's lots of barriers to move through to get to key loading rooms or that sort of thing. And yeah, it all takes a lot of time. And not surprisingly, the number one issue seemingly for individuals performing key management tasks on this webinar is wasted time.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I've had that where I've traveled with people to data centers, spent hours in the car, and then we got there and somebody had forgotten a brass key. So we had to go back to the head office, reschedule the the visit till the next day. And now it ended up costing I suppose 4 man hours and days. And then we had to do the whole thing again. So it was crazy.
Yeah. Well, I think going on from there, I mean, let's discuss a little bit about how the world is changing and how it has changed. I've pulled out some stats here, which I've put on the screen, and basically, I mean, the first thing I want to establish is that the global HSM revenue for 2020 reached 1.4 billion USD and has shown long-term steady growth. So organizations are clearly aware of the importance of hardware security modules and using hardware to actually secure keys and cryptographic data. So I think the importance and the understanding for the need for these devices is very much there, and I think of course it's driven a lot by regulatory requirements and so on. But similarly, on the cloud side, public cloud service market is expected to reach $623 billion by 2023 worldwide. 94% of enterprises already use a cloud service of some kind. And in 2021, the public cloud infrastructure will grow by 35%. And I mean, my experience with our own internal client base is that 95% of our clients have some or other cloud migration project plans in place to move some of their processing and services into the cloud.
Yeah, it's the same for me. I think that a lot of payments environments and payments infrastructures are often maybe a little behind the curve sometimes with with being more dynamic in terms of their infrastructure. Like I remember, we go back like 10, 12 years, a lot of financial institutions were quite slow about implementing virtualization and moving away from everything being dedicated hardware. Similarly, if we look at things like containerization, that's something that in the last few years, an awful lot of people are moving to, and people are moving to the cloud as well. But for financial institutions, we're still very often tied to legacy physical on-premise infrastructure. But I think that's starting to change. And like you say, most of our clients do have projects in place to move to the cloud. So I definitely do think that's it's clearly the future.
I think the challenges are introduced with cryptographic architecture, particularly where historically you are expected to have a device. It's a single piece of hardware. It's been hardened. It's been sort of configured to be tamper resistant, all of that. It relies on a physical element there. And of course, moving into the cloud, cloud is all about scalability. It's all about containerization or virtualization, economies of scale to be able to rapidly grow and also to offer services specific to a customer's consumption needs. So, you pay for what you use, basically. And I think the challenges in the hardware security module world is that generally it's a physically secure device. It tends to need to be dedicated to a certain degree and so on.
I think the challenge is in the name. I mean, we're talking about a hardware security module where you need 2 people to control it. It contains a key. The key's never out of there. it's a physical device that you can go and touch and say, I know my keys are in here. The whole, one of the huge things about going to the cloud is you abstract all the service and functionality away from the physical infrastructure. So, from a traditional sense, to look at, to be able to say, I know my keys are physically in this tangible box there, and then putting that in the cloud, you just can't do it. So you need to have other controls in place. And you still, even when we talk about HSMs in the cloud, we still need the same functionality and we still need the same physicality. So, what we kind of expect to see is that cloud vendors have fleets of physical HSMs that are clustered but provide dedicated security worlds. I mean, we'll come on to that in a while, in more detail. But in terms of what a HSM enforces through things like dual control and physical key management and kind of physical or key operations in terms of encryption and decryption on the device, there's still things that we need to be able to see.
I'd like to launch another poll for our listeners. So we have a question: does your organization have a cloud migration project running currently? Yes or no? Andy, I think it's more than just cloud. I think it's distributed infrastructure. I mean, many organizations that we work with have distributed infrastructure, data centers all over the world, where they're managing cryptographic architecture across multiple geographies. And I think it's also the aspect of remote working that is something that is part of this conversation, because of course we're looking at key management, we're looking at hardware security modules, and we're looking at that being in a distributed environment, potentially the physical elements of that not being directly managed by an organization, but still allowing that organization to manage things like keys and keep their keys safe and so on. And once again, not surprisingly, 75% of the respondents on this webinar have said that they currently do have a cloud migration project taking place. So case in point there, really, that we need to start, or at least the conversation around cryptographic architecture and how this operates in a cloud and distributed infrastructure world is absolutely something that needs to be addressed.
Because I think going from having everything in data centers, where you're still working on everything remotely, but you can still physically access the environment if you want, because you're still going to be remotely working on everything in the cloud. You don't have the option to physically access the environment, and it's a big difference. I think the other thing is that even though we're used to remotely accessing production environments, we're traditionally used to doing that from a corporate office where there's a bunch of people working and they all work together. I think now with COVID, with the increase of remote work, and also with things like globally distributed businesses where they're online only. So you have companies like GitLab or Fastly where they don't have offices. Everybody works remotely, and they still have a dependence on modern cryptography to be able to secure their clients' infrastructure. So there are people doing this, but it's not much in financial institutions.
Yeah, I think before we get into what an ideal future may look like around key management and management of cryptographic architecture, let's discuss a little bit around the standards: NIST, ANSI, ISO, PCI. What are essentially the main points of the cryptographic or standards that address cryptography and management of keys and cryptographic hardware? What is the essence behind the standards in terms of what they require from organizations?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is that you need to have dual control for key generation or key loading.
Sure.
And that's enforced generally by the software on the HSM itself. The other thing is that you've approved encryption algorithms and key lengths. So you're only able to execute functions and keys that are secure, whether they be symmetric or asymmetric, that have been satisfied with certain cryptographic standards. The other thing is that and this is kind of a big one, is that the encryption itself occurs on the HSM. So what we often see if we look at kind of cloud HSM infrastructure or server, it's more key management services from cloud vendors. We can see that the keys are generated and the keys are stored on hardware security modules that they manage, but the data isn't stored there. So applications running in the cloud are often fetching the keys and then storing the keys in software memory on, kind of just regular computer infrastructure and using that for the encryption, decryption operations. Whereas what we need to see is that they're using the kind of crypto accelerators on HSMs, and that the keys, the data goes to the device to be encrypted, and the keys don't need to leave the device. So that's something that is one of the key things that needs to happen with HSMs in the cloud. It doesn't currently seem to be in place so much.
Yeah, and I think, besides the physical elements of oversight and protection of these devices, which are also important from a standards perspective, we'd like to launch another poll here for the attendees. So, do industry compliance and regulatory standards require you to maintain an HSM, hardware security module, for cryptographic processing and key management?
So one of the things, just like in terms of the industry compliance regulatory standards, like P2P and PIN, they both require the HSMs to be FIPS compliant or to be PTS HSM compliant. So it's specifically stated in those what kind of security levels need to be in place on those devices. In terms of, I'm just having a look at some of the questions that are coming. So we'll answer a couple of those as we're going through.
Yeah, so while the polling's taking place, right, the stats have just come in, and of course 84% have said yes to that. Well, that's a good thing, because it may not be very valuable for you if you weren't using HSMs to sit through this. But I mean, I guess it's interesting to just understand how this type of management of crypto infrastructure would take place in the future. And of course, use of an HSM is always something that's considered more secure than key management and crypto processing in software. So I think, Andy, just in terms of how things could look in the future, I mean, if we just turn our attention to the screen there. So yeah, we have, individuals potentially working from a remote office or working from home and in different locations. These individuals are connecting up to either distributed or infrastructure that's sitting in a cloud-based environment. And of course, there's servers, HSMs, and whatever else they need to connect to perform operational duties and all sorts of things. So how do we get to this ideal world where the getting on a plane and going to a data center and typing in something manually or capturing a key on a piece of paper or something like that is something of the past?
So I suppose if we look at the cloud part, the expectation would be that the cloud service provider is hosting a fleet or a cluster of HSMs. And on the HSMs, there's a level of kind of virtualization in terms of dedicated security worlds being applied to different clients. So essentially, it's multi-tenant physical infrastructure. So if Foregenix, for example, wants to manage keys there, then we have our own access control and we have our own key tables, and that's completely segmented from the keys or key environments of other key holders or HSM.
So like a partition almost.
Exactly. Then what you want for your remote workers is that, well, I suppose you need to have integration between the HSM's user management and the identity and access management from the cloud provider. So if we take Alice in the middle and Bob on the left, then Alice could be part of security group 1 and Bob could be part of security group 2. And what you'd want is each of those, or one member of each of those teams, would have to log on to be able to enable any key management activity. Now, the person over on the right could be the kind of the supervisor or the overseer of those activities. So they could enable the initial session so the others could log in, or they could just oversee and make sure that everything is as it should be. They could verify the identities of the people connected. But it still allows you to have dual control in order to enable any sensitive operations.
Okay. What about capturing of keys? There's always that element of having to interact with potential partners that are using legacy processes and so on and so forth.
Well,
how does one cater for that?
Well, before getting to legacy process, let's say, ideally, you're not going to have anything paper-based. So when you create keys, you create symmetric keys. And when you export them using public-private keys. So you're using kind of PKI and asymmetric keys along with your symmetric keys. If you need entities to, if you have partners who are going to send you paper-based material, you need a way to, that's going to have to be received by the appropriate key custodian. It's probably going to be received at their home. There's not much other way about it. But they'll need some sort of kind of pin entry device or secure pin pad to be able to enter that component. Now, to do that, you need to ensure that you have encryption and authentication all the way from the pin entry device up to the HSM. So earlier we talked about the dual authentication of the different individuals from their homes. So they're going to have multi-factor authentication to the cloud service provider. They're going to have connectivity and a secure channel direct through the dual control access from their laptop to the HSM itself. And then what you're probably going to need to have in having a secure pin pad is a trust relationship at a certificate level between a pin pad that's connected to the laptop that provides a secure channel between the PTS device and the HSM. So then you can transmit a component encrypted without it going through the memory of a multi-purpose computing platform.
Yeah. So, I mean, ideally, storage of keys on or key components on a smart card, an encrypted channel between a device and a HSM using some kind of secure cryptographic device. I think both serves a purpose for authenticating the custodian to the device for operational processes, but also allows the encryption of sensitive data like keys to be transferred back and forth from the HSM, be it in order to back up keys or capture a key provided by a third party or something like that. I think that the next question that I'm thinking the audience is thinking about here is, well, what about transferring the keys to a third party entity? How do we handle that? And I'll push us along to the next slide, and perhaps you can talk us through how that potentially could work, Andy.
Well, let's say we're two parties who want to exchange a key. So I have a symmetric key on my HSM. I want to give you the same symmetric key. What I do is I'd ask you for your public key. You'd provide me with that. I'd load your public key to my HSM. I'd encrypt the symmetric key that I have with your public key. I'd send it back to you, and then you'd load it to your HSM and decrypt that cryptogram using your private key. If we were to do that at the moment, we might have key components, we might be using couriers. It might take a week, it might take a month. What we could do is I could give you a secure channel, you could give me a secure channel from which I could load or download your public key. I could phone you, we could have an encrypted call. I could verify the hash of your public key. I could see you and verify that it's you. I could check your ID. Then I could load it to my HSM and encrypt my key. Then when I give it to you and you've loaded it and decrypted it, you can validate with me what the key check value of the key was. So we could do this all, we could do all this in real time. And we could do it from the comfort of our own homes. It's kind of ideal.
I think in this day and age of things like Teams or Zoom or video conferencing and so on, I mean, it would be so easy to verify someone's identity if they were to send you a public key and then give you the hash value over a conference call. You'd be able to know that this is the person that sent me the key. This is the correct key that I was supposed to receive. From a public key perspective, because of course it's a public key, so it can be sent in that manner. And then using that to encrypt something, send it back and do a verification process in the same way. I think it'll just make key transfers quicker and life a lot easier, I think, just in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can make things a lot faster. I think one of the really nice things about it, like if we were looking at if we consider the previous slide of Alice and Bob working remotely, they never even have to meet each other. They actually, they don't even need to know who the other is. So from a threat of collusion, that's totally removed. And that's, they don't even need to be, physically present in the same room. It can be the key ceremony organizer who just says, I need one person from this team, one person from the other team. They don't need to know, and those custodians don't need to be aware of the other. I think that's great.
Well, yeah, I mean, that does sound great, but I guess let's talk about what are the roadblocks to an ideal future. And I think probably the first conversation we need to have is around compliance and regulatory standards. So, in terms of the standards, I know sort of browsing through some of the PCI and NIST ISO related standards, the standards are currently written from the context of the fact that it's expecting two people to be physically at a console of an HSM, and that key management activities are going to be done in that environment. It also addresses things like things that are used to authorize or authenticate the device needs to be under dual control and stored securely. Now, of course, if you've got custodians at home, potentially handling key components or cryptographic devices that are used to authenticate, although the dual control mechanisms are inherently met, given that these individuals are potentially in completely different locations. But the secure storage element, poses a bit of a question mark. Wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to see that we just got rid of paper. I mean, in the example we thought that we used, that somebody would be at home entering something into a pin pad device. I think once they've entered that, a key component can be encrypted on the keypad or in a key table and just stored as a cryptogram somewhere. And then that person can destroy that paper. And then hopefully they'll be working with partners who will be sharing public keys so that they can send their keys that way. So I think ultimately we want to be able to get away from paper altogether. I think one of the big things with PKI is we need to make sure this comes down partly to interoperability and what's provided by the vendors, is we need to be able to make sure that when you have a strong encryption key or a strong symmetric key like AES 256, the equivalence to encrypt that for asymmetric keys from an RSA perspective is a 15,000 bit long key, which is insane. But you could use a much smaller elliptic curve cryptography key. So we need to see more elliptic curve cryptography, more PKI relying on that. And then you've got, speed, you've interoperability, and you're using some of the kind of more, modern conveniences.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the other issues that present itself are on the interoperability and capability of hardware security modules currently. I mean, as you know, these things have been designed in a particular way that kind of meets the standards, because obviously it's incredibly heavily regulated, where you have PTS certifications and various other certifications that these devices have to comply to. And I think, what I feel at the moment in terms of, solutions that I've worked with is that there seems to be very little remote administration capability for these devices. And of course, also, as you go across manufacturers, there's various different ways in which a particular manufacturer might manage keys. Some allow storage of keys on the device, some allow the storage of a single key on the device with other devices stored outside of that device, encrypted with the key on the device. Other types of manufacturers use like the security world approach, where there's sort of keys within a secure sort of portable cryptographic zone. But of course, that portability doesn't necessarily go across different HSM manufacturers, but within that one sort of manufacturer's logic. So I think there's also some of the challenges around around that area, and I think just before you respond to that, Andy, I'd like to announce our last poll for today, and I'd like to get the view of the audience. That in your view, what is the biggest challenges to migrating your cryptographic architecture to a cloud-based environment, or just purely managing your cryptographic architecture remotely? What is the number one issue? And of course, the answers are remote administration capabilities, security concerns where other entities might be managing or having responsibility for securing your keys, the cost associated with that, compliance and regulatory standards as a barrier to that, and of course, knowledge or expertise, or the lack of knowledge and expertise in that area. So I think it will be interesting to see what the audience thinks of.
Yeah, I think it's. I mean, the big ones that I pick out there, the remote administration capability and the compliance regulatory standard. And I think there's a bit of a chicken and egg problem between the two. It's very difficult for people to push the manufacturers to drive innovation in this area when they're not going to be able to satisfy compliance.
Absolutely.
So manufacturers are doing what they need to do to satisfy compliance. So are users. So does who's going to make the first move? Who's going to create that push? And it's I think it would be probably naive to think that the regulatory standards are going to be the ones who are really dynamic and innovative in this area. So I think we need to see the push between the HSM kind of manufacturers and the cloud security providers, and then hopefully the standards will follow suit.
Well, not surprisingly, compliance and regulatory standards are the most popular response there. Of course, remote administration capabilities and knowledge and expertise. And I think this kind of leads us into our closing remarks here. So I think much of the technology already exists, and the capability is there, but there's still work to be done to get the management of cryptographic architecture and key management to where it should be in a modern world. And I think the changes that need to happen are firstly, or not firstly, but I think equally with the compliance and regulatory bodies who need to update and modernize standards to cater for these types of operating models that are potentially going to be used more prevalently in the future. Of course, likewise, manufacturers and vendors of hardware security modules and cryptographic devices need to also modernize and update the capability of devices to have remote administration and also administration potentially from separate locations and so on. So to build in that capability and potential portability or interoperability across other platforms. I know we spoke about sort of open standards before, Andy, and I think that's an important aspect as well. And then finally, security professionals to create awareness and help to design and develop new solutions to provide understanding of the requirements and the intent of the requirements. I think a lot of the time the intent behind requirements are lost, and it's important to understand, well, you know, these requirements say this because this needs to be met. And as technology evolves, of course, the way certain controls can be established also evolve. And you know, I think we have a responsibility to assist and help our clients to look at new ways of doing things in this space.
I think that's a really good point just there, and some of the standards that, in terms of the evolution, that a massive amount of them are written with the expectation that there's going to be encryption keys or encryption key components going over the wire in clear text. And that's why everything has to be done kind of so local to the device. But if nothing comes off the device in clear text, there's a massive amount of requirements that are no longer applicable. So it could be, it could really simplify your compliance as well.
Yeah. Well, with that, I think you know, we'll close off the presentation. So thank you everyone for joining. What we'll do now is we'll move into a bit of Q&A. So I hope you've enjoyed the presentation, and please feel free to submit your questions to on the question answer poll. Andy, you did say you had a look at the questions earlier. Would you like to answer some of these? Just to the audience on the webinar, if we don't get around to answering all the questions, we'll try and get in touch with you, or you get in touch with us, and we'll try and answer these either in a blog post or directly within the next week, so that we can provide the feedback that you need. And of course, you know, we're going to approach this in an honest way. In some cases, we might not know the answer. There might not be an answer. So it'll be interesting to go through some of these.
I mean, there's a question. So the question from Ismail Hassan, in terms of many of the banks are asking for FIPS 140 level 3 HSMs. Is there a particular standard that's driving this requirement? The main one that I know of driving that is PIN security and P2P security, because those specifically require FIPS level 3 HSM devices. They'll also accept that they be PTS HSM, so they've been validated by labs kind of sponsored by the PCI Security Council. But you know, it's really the stuff around kind of PIN and P2P encryption. For regular PCI, even though you need to have encryption, it doesn't mandate that you use a HSM. So I think that brings us to the question from Desmond about when will regulators, just last thing for Ishmael, for any technologies I can recommend for FIPS level 3, I can't really recommend anything in particular. I mean, the big vendors that we usually work with, people like, Thales and SafeNet and FutureX and, Townsend, there's a bunch, but you can see a lot of those on the FIPS listings. The question from Desmond in terms of accommodating new ways of working. So again, you can use Cloud HSM from AWS or key management services from Google, similar from Azure, and they're all compliant services at the moment. The mechanisms for bring your own key kind of differs between them, but they're providing a PCI compliant platform that allow you to interact with it to generate and utilize keys with your applications and for encryption of data, or for extensible encryption with your databases. So that's already possible to do in the cloud.
Is the question I'd like to take from an anonymous attendee. So I have a question about public key transfers and how and where would the component be encrypted with the public key, avoiding capturing the component on multipurpose computing platforms? That's a really good question, because of course, if a public key is sent to a third party, you wouldn't want that individual to capture the key component on their laptop and potentially encrypt the public key there. So the expectation would be that the HSM would import this public key, and then basically when a component is generated, it is encrypted within the HSM of the sending entity under that public key for the receiving entity. And that cryptogram is then sent to the receiving entity, which will have the key component or the the whole symmetric key, encrypted with their public key. They would then import that into their HSM in a similar way, to ensure that you never have clear text cryptographic keys anywhere outside of a secure cryptographic device, because ultimately, of course, that is the most secure way of managing that.
So that would actually kind of leads quite well into a question from Neil Adams, just which is, if both key custodians need to be logged on to the virtual HSM for dual control, how do you prevent both from seeing a key component generated by one of the custodians and guarantee that this control is working? Which is a really good question in terms of, if you're physically there in a room, you request the other individuals to turn away from the HSM or to go to another part of the secure room. If you're doing this remotely, you'd expect that key components would be output on the console of the HSM itself. So to get around that, what you'd say, if you do need to export your components in clear text, what you'd want to have is a secure pin pad that the custodian themselves have. So it's only published remotely on their screen using that handheld device, and that it's not on it's not visible server side on the console. And I think that would be a way of getting around that. I mean, ideally, any export would be under a public key anyway, or under a working key encryption key. But if it did need to be components, you can just put it out on a secure handheld device.
It's a pretty long question here that I'm going to address. So the question's as follows. I've seen COVID-19 guidance on the PCI SSE website relating to specific HSM crypto PCI assessments being given on request grace periods. Aside from these, is there any official guidance on how to deal with the risk and indeed compliance implications of having to consciously violate some of the security measures of current non-cloud crypto processes due to COVID-19? As a specific example, if a key ritual stipulates 3 people performing different roles in a ritual, is it acceptable for this to be suspended and have one person perform all 3 roles due to offices, DCs largely being closed, unstaffed? Yeah, that's a challenging question. Look, the short answer is that, of course, any violation of the compliance requirements is non-compliant. So there is no leeway by the PCI Council or other bodies in terms of violating controls such as dual control requirements or split knowledge requirements or any type of requirements on account of COVID. Of course, that's from an evaluation and audit perspective that will be looked at. If there are emergency situations to handle certain things, they would have to be handled in a particular way. And of course, incident response processes and governance around that is established when evaluating your control framework to make sure that you can cater for those type of events. It's one individual running all roles of a key management ceremony and essentially potentially having access to all elements of a key component ultimately compromises your key, which means that that key can be considered known to someone. And if the key is considered known to someone, that would mean that any data that's being protected by that key is also known to that individual. And of course, the risk associated with that is huge, obviously depending on what data is being encrypted there. But unfortunately, there is no allowance from the PCI Council perspective, and essentially any assessor would approach this in the same way and say that, if you break these processes, it would mean that you would be deemed non-compliant, and there isn't any allowance stipulating otherwise. Andy, would you agree with that response?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. And it's the case that we've had clients who weren't able to go to their data centers during COVID, and it was a disaster in terms of some of the contracts with their partners because they just couldn't They couldn't export keys or import new keys, and it just really hampered some of their work. And there was nothing they could do about it.
Yeah.
I'll just take a couple of questions there. One is, if transferring a key to another key member using the method suggested, would this not mean two copies of the key will exist? And how can you control single key existence in this scenario? I mean, I suppose one of the things is, let's say I want to send a key to Paolo. I mean, typically I need to go to a safe, take out the key component, transcribe the key component to another piece of paper, put the original piece of paper back in a tamper-evident bag back into the safe, and then send it to Paolo. So you always have multiple copies of any given component when you're sharing it with third parties. So I don't think there's really much mechanism to prevent that. I think what's better is if they're cryptograms and you've less people who have access to the various keys. So if you're sending something encrypted by a public key and the private key never leaves a HSM, then you can be secure in the knowledge that it's been distributed and it's okay. I'm just going to answer the next question just by names of it. It says that we described a model for an ideal future. And the question is the reality today still that almost all organizations are relying wholly on secure couriers sending staff in person to get a key from organization A's HSM to organization B's HSM? And the response is pretty much yes. I mean, if you're exchanging keys with a third party, you might use a KEK from that third party, but to get the KEK originally or initially, you're going to exchange it using key components, and that's still using couriers. Where we talked earlier about using elliptic key cryptography or asymmetric keys to protect keys, I, for one, have never seen someone use a 15,000-bit RSA key to protect an AES 256-bit key for transportation. Similarly, for elliptic curve cryptography, I haven't seen it that much. So yeah, people are still generally using couriers to distribute keys, at least prior to having a PKI in place.
All right, thanks, Andy. Next question. What is the most difficult part of the PCI pin security assessments nowadays? For example, how do you make an assessment of an entity for key operations remotely? Well, in the current COVID climate, essentially, as the earlier question sort of alluded to, there's a lot of extensions that are provided, because the fact that many key operation assessments and assessments of cryptographic infrastructure basically require on-site visits, observations, and walkthroughs with processes. The council have allowed remote video recording of these processes that could be done as an alternative to observe the process, to actually being physically there. But that doesn't come without its challenges. Of course, the ideal scenario is to actually be on site and to observe these processes taking place. Of course, also, some operational processes in organizations require that the use of phones and recording equipment not be present at all in things like key injection facilities and around key management operational processes. So the idea is that you could potentially use remote recording to satisfy the need to observe certain requirements in these assessments, but ideally physical presence of the assessor is what would be required. So if it can be postponed, the assessment, I mean, then you should probably look at going that route. If it cannot, then discuss with your assessor what would potentially be possible based on the setup in your environment. Okay, Andy, do you want to, is there another one in particular that you'd like to take here? Or I'm just going to go down the line.
Yeah, I think it's coming up to five to the hour, so I think we'll have to finish up in a moment. So maybe we can just take one more and then look at responding to some of these offline.
Sure. Well, I mean, let me take some of the quick ones. So when do we think there'll be a PTS approved HSM for use with the cloud P2P solution? This is from Jason. Jason, basically there are, I mean, of course, HSM in itself, HSMs in itself need to be PTS compliant or FIPS 140-2 level 3 and up compliant. But there are some solutions that are certified for things like point-to-point encryption, where you have decryption management operations that are certified. In the public cloud, there isn't really, you know, Amazon or Azure having something like this in place, but you have things like, you know, VirtueCrypt and other organizations like Bluefin and organizations that provide sort of decryption service / private cloud decryption operations that allow organizations to connect to those entities, and they are listed P2P decryption component providers on the P2P listings on the PCI SSC website. So that's the closest thing really at this point to organizations that actually offer compliant sort of cloud-based or managed services in terms of cryptography. And of course, you know, each of the solutions differ in terms of how keys are managed. In some cases, there's a bring your own key scheme. In other cases, it's we'll do all the key management for you. You know, there are a couple of solutions out there, and you know, if you want more details, we can potentially take that offline and have a more in-depth discussion around that.
Yeah. So
sorry.
unfortunately, we are running out of time. We can complete those questions directly offline. So if you agree, we can finish now.
Okay. Yeah. Apologies. We will certainly take those questions and compile a response and get the feedback to the remaining individuals that asked the questions.
Yeah, some great questions there. Thanks, and thanks everyone for attending.
There are still a lot of questions pending. So thank you very much for watching us today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we hope to see you in future webinars. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.